Hey guys, if you don't know me, I just like to get right to the point. Because the kind of work that I've done for the last 13 years centers around people. People living today, not yesterday, not 100 years in the future, people of today. Because there's enough people talking about the past, there's enough people talking about the future. And everything that I've thought about doing and accomplishing comes from the idea that a person's well-being matters. That their mental state, their job, their passions, and everything should branch out from there. Whatever policy you're talking about or whatever initiative. And it's something that I've built on over the years. First as a counselor, then as chief counselor, and as MLA, it opened up a new world for me to understand that, ultimately we're all in this together. And no matter what your walk of life is, what your race is, at the end of the day, we're all the same. We all want to look after our family. We want to go and play a sport. We want to go to a theater. We want to do stuff. And do things that today's society provides us with. And that's all that really matters. Get rid of the politics. Get away from all the arguments about all the different issues regarding United States. Like I care whether or not Donald Trump woke up this morning and had breakfast. Who cares? So what I want to talk to you guys today about is something I haven't really heard discussing. And you probably read a Financial Post article that hinted about how the environmental movement has actually stopped the progress of First Nations in BC and Canada. Now really, when you're talking about that, you're talking about one of the only proven methods for Aboriginals to help themselves. Because the Indian Act can't do it. Treaty negotiations will not do it. And programs that have been basically provided for First Nations in Canada for the last 50 years have not succeeded. And yet when you look at the evidence of First Nations who embrace economic development for the jobs, the training, their social issues go away. And those First Nations have the ability to address their own issues on their own terms without asking for permission, without asking for money. So that's why I find it so despicable that the environmental lobbying group, just like they did with the seal hunt, has stopped the development of First Nations in BC. But what I want to talk to you today about is how this environmental movement is affecting all of BC and all of Canada, whether you're First Nations or not. First, I want to tell you that this environmental movement is not an environmental movement. It's a campaign. It's a campaign to stop oil and gas products from reaching Asia. That's what it is. It's stopping the development of BC and Canada in general. And the result is our biggest competitor and our biggest benefactor is actually reaping the rewards. While we shut down our oil and gas production here and our exports, the United States has ramped it up, even under Obama. They're taking a greater market share. So is anybody else angry that non-Canadian interests are brainwashing Canadians to stop our own growth and stop us from accessing Asian markets? And don't get me wrong, environmental standards is a good fight to have if you're improving environmental standards and if you want to see industry do a better job of environmental standards, but that is not what this is about. If that was the case, and people really want to improve on environmental standards for BC, then why don't you take a good look at the environmental standards we already have, which are probably the highest in North America, if not the world? Because the environmental movement is not about improving environmental standards. It's about shutting BC down. That's what it's about. There is no talking any sense into this movement, if it is a movement at all. And what I find wrong about this campaign, this shut down Canada BC, it's all built on fear-mongering. It's all built on propaganda. The idea that Canada is responsible for global warming. You don't even register on the scale of global warming. If we shut down all the emissions and all the carbon dioxide, cars, trucks, lawnmowers, snowmobiles, boats, buses, people breathing, it wouldn't even make a difference. So Canada, why are you beating yourselves up thinking you're one of the top polluters in the world? You're not. You are not the top polluter. You're probably the answer. Everybody should be following our lead in terms of what we're doing. And it's outside influence that's doing it for us, that are dictating the way we think. And I can't understand why Canadians aren't angry about this. How outside influence is brainwashing us to say that we should shut down oil and gas exports, and meanwhile, they take a greater market share, especially when you think about the news today. The United States is outraged that Russia has possibly been meddling in U.S. elections. So they're going to investigate it. They're subpoenaing people. Well, Canada, outside interests have been meddling in your politics, in your elections, and your resource development for the last 10, 20 years. How come you're not outraged? How come there's no investigation? And it wouldn't be a hard investigation, because there's tax records that prove this, and there's even websites that are non-Canadian funded that brag about how they affected Canadian elections. There's even websites that brag about how successful they are at shutting Canada down. This is absolutely crazy. And me, being a chief counselor at the Haisla, you know, very patriotic, very loyal, very aggressive, very passionate. And had anybody got in my way, hey, good luck to you. I'm not going to let anybody stand in my way. And then I come to this position, and Canada, you're willing to lay down for anybody that actually stops your growth. I don't see any loyalty to the well-being of Canadians. I don't see any patriotism. I don't see any anger that we're being manipulated by some of the biggest manipulators in the world, whose sole goal is to shut us down. I truly believe that we've got to move toward a green future. I truly believe that. The whole world should, not just Canada. But you shouldn't fear or make us make decisions on a green future based on fear and guilt and misinformation. We shouldn't be deciding that. And that's ultimately what I'm seeing today. Because the bottom line is you can't have a green energy future without fossil fuels. You can't do it. The vehicles that are extracting the resources to build your windmills and your solar panels, they're using fossil fuels to get that out of the ground, into the manufacturers, and into the places where they want this green energy. It's not running on unicorn spit. It's running on diesel, gas, oil. And if you think about this, we're probably the only country that's actually going 100% towards the agreement made in Paris. Meanwhile, the rest of the biggest polluters in the world are not doing it. Russia, United States, India, China, for their own reasons, are looking after their own first. And this idea that U.S. is it's a bad thing that the U.S. is putting in protection measures. Yeah, it's a bad thing when it affects our economy as Canadians. But when I think about it, how come Canada's not doing it? How come we're not protecting what's important to us? How come we're not protecting the well-being of Canadians? Why are we not going out there and being aggressive on the markets so that the results come back and benefit us as British Columbians and Canadians? I don't know if you call it protectionism. I'd say I call it looking after your own first before you go out and fix the rest of the world. And this misinformation, and this information taken out of context, and the propaganda and the brainwashing, it's so embedded in Canadians. I'll give you an example. A governor from the United States said that he was concerned about the transportation of oil coming from tankers, coming from Kinder Morgan. And if it ever came down to it, the United States would come and take one for the team to help clean up a tanker spill. That's your frickin' oil coming from Alaska going down to Washington State. Don't you see this, Canadians? If there's ever a spill that's going to happen, it's going to come from American oil because Canadians have higher standards and they're proposing even higher standards. You're being sold a bridge that doesn't exist. We got to wake up. And we got to protect Canadians' interests first. And we got to understand the facts that are out there right now. Because the only losers in this game right now is Canadians. To the benefit of everybody else. I was going to try to do this without glasses, but I can't do it. I think I'm getting blurry from getting angry up here. You know, when we're talking about this, and then I had to go change my speech given that rally they had here at 10 o'clock this morning. That was an amazing rally. And I was invited up here to speak, or be present, and they did an amazing job, just amazing. So I had to go change my speech. But you know the thing about this, I'm more than willing to have a conversation about a green future if the other side is willing to have a conversation too. But right now, the way I see it is that this green campaign, which is not about improving environmental status, but shutting down resource industries, I can tell you it's a campaign that's ultimately going to hurt taxpayers, ratepayers, and people that have jobs today. That's what it's going to do. And if as Canadians, if you really want to see proof of how it's going to affect you, then look at the example of Eastern Canada that used political influence to go after a green energy future. It's their citizens that are paying higher rates, higher taxes, and the energy they're using is not dependable, and it's expensive. Germany's going through the same thing. It's a good idealistic vision. But I don't agree with anything that makes life tough for citizens of today. And we should be taking lessons on how the citizens in Germany and Eastern Canada are getting affected in a very negative fashion today. We should take lessons, and it shouldn't, if we're going to do this green future, it shouldn't be based on fear, and we shouldn't let politicians decide what's good for the future. We should learn from examples, and we should get technical people in that understand economics, that understand affordability, and understand the cost before we jump into a green future. And this is what I don't. This is part of the conversation that the green lobbyists refuse to have with me, because it's their way or nothing. We're going to shut it down, and we're going to have this green economy. We're going to have windmills all over the place, and we're going to have solar panels. Do you know how much land you're going to need to power up BC? With all these windmills, you're not going to have room for hospitals or roads or anything else. You're going to blanket the entire province with all this stuff. So have a realistic conversation and have a two-way conversation. Because in the end, people suffer. I'll leave you with this. Because when I was asking what they want me to talk about, it was suggested that I talk about what I've learned since I've been an MLA. And I need a week to go through that. But I will tell you this, I'll leave you with this. This campaign to stop the export of oil and gas to Asia so our competitors can have a bigger market share, it's a pretty disgusting campaign. And the people that are running this campaign and mouthing off and criticizing us for doing it, I can tell you right now, they do not care about you. They don't care that you lose your job. They don't care that you're going to lose your house on Monday to the bank. They don't care that your mom or your dad has to leave the province or the country to get a job, and they don't care about the pressure that puts on their family because the family's breaking up. They don't care about that. They don't care about your alcohol and drug abuse issues because you're going to welfare to jobs, to Alberta, Manitoba, Yukon. They don't care about that. They don't care about the social issues. They don't care about the economic pressures that are being put on Canadians, and the only solution they have is to commit suicide. They do not care about that. I do. And until there's a realistic conversation, a mature, realistic conversation based on the facts and based on this competitive world we're living in, then I don't want to hear any more about this green energy future unless you talk about the well-being of the people of Canada. Thank you very much. Me and Derek. Okay.
All right, folks, there you have it. Start pigeonholing your questions because I need you now to welcome Derek Orr, the Business Development Manager for Carrier Lumber, former Chief McLeod Lake Indian Band, who's agreed to moderate our Q&A with Ellis. All right, Derek, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Ellis, and very happy to be here to ask you some questions and get some audience input. I'm a firm believer of economic development myself, and as a leader of the First Nation community prior, focused on that to provide education, culture, and other opportunity, and especially long-term sustainability for our members, so happy to be here. So you talked about the green campaign. And what do you think are some of the solutions, maybe just a couple to get started to really combat that and get us to where we need to be?
Is this thing on? Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me? Or should I use the mic? I can't hear anything. Yeah, okay. Hey, how do we get started? Average BC citizen, Canadian citizens, got to know what's going on. Everything I've talked about is documented. It's fact. They're hiding in plain sight. But people, being people, they got busy lives, they're looking after their families, they're going to work. They don't really read the substance of anything that's as boring as a conference like this is, because you only read the first 3 lines. So people are more willing to believe the worst when they read a headline. They're not willing to listen to facts. In fact, I'll go even further. they're more willing to believe somebody that has a title of doctor. Like, you could have a PhD in yoga, the average citizen will believe them. Or a pop star, you know, who's not too busy lip syncing and dancing around on a stage, who's married to what's his name, they're more willing to listen to that person than reading about the facts. And I'm talking about everything. I'm talking about oil sands, I'm talking about natural gas, I'm talking about forestry. So somehow, the information that we talk about in conferences like this, it's got to be put in the form where people understand we're really talking about them. We're talking about you. And it's got to be done in a way that people understand, average people understand that. Because the information's there. Let me tell you, it's in Canadian Revenue Agency records, it's in the IRS records, it's on the web, it's on the internet. Sorry, that's an old term, web. It's on the internet. So I think that's a very first step, to start educating people in a common language.
Thanks, Ellis. So we got some questions here, and you'll see the one with 16 votes there. Ellis, do you think it's time for environmental organizations to be required to declare their source of funding?
They already do. They already do. And you know, going further than that, there's already letters of complaint into Canada elections on how non-Canadian interests are manipulating Canadian elections. Isn't that crazy? There's an organization that is not Canadian based that was bragging that they helped defeat Stephen Harper. Isn't that amazing? I'm angry. I'm not affiliated with the federal conservatives or the liberals or the NDP or anything like that. I could really care less about who is over there in Ottawa, but the fact that a non-Canadian entity is manipulating our elections and freaking bragging about it on the internet, that makes me angry. That means non-Canadian interests are guiding our future. So they're already disclosing.
Thanks, Ellis. So we hear that a certain MLA threatening to bring down the government if it encourages LNG. If the government proposed a tool to move with LNG, will your party work with the government and stick it to that MLA?
You know what, that's a lot of talk. That's a lot of talk. And the NDP had a change of heart about their support for LNG over the years. And I'm really anxious to see how that comes up in the budget. Because you can say you support LNG all day long, but it's your actions that's going to really prove what you support and what you don't support. So I'm looking forward to the session coming up in February where I can actually look in the budget. But in terms of that, in terms of sticking to that MLA, him bringing down government because he doesn't support LNG. I mean, the majority of the Northwest that I know of supports LNG. And this is part of the problem that I see with proportional representation, where a small minority out of the Vancouver Island gets to dictate what happens to all the rest of us in northwestern BC. And this is what I'm talking about. Like, you put a title in front of somebody, or you put a PhD or a bachelor or something like that, and somehow this person's got all the answers. He doesn't have the answers. And this is kind of the person that does not care about us. I'm sure he didn't care that I took on welfare probably 3 or 4 times during my life. He doesn't care that I wandered the village going down the alcohol and drug. They don't care. They got a single mandate in mind. In this case, it's proportional representation. And if that's a hill he wants to die on, and he wants to fight about it, sure, I'll fight. But sticking it to him, I don't think that's the fight we should have. I think we should get this government to prove that they support LNG. Prove it. Prove it in the budget. Prove it with any type of incentives or initiatives that you're working on with LNG Canada or Chevron.
Thanks, Ellis. So we have a couple more questions here. Great audience, keep them coming. Do you suggest environmentalists should do that would be more effective, protecting the environment values while also protecting culture and economy?
Who's to say they're not doing it? The thing that angers me is that people talking about how they should revamp the environmental assessment. I've been doing environmental assessments for 13 years. I didn't see any of these people that are criticizing it at those tables. A lot of people are talking about this have never even seen an environmental assessment at work. They haven't seen the permitting process that comes underneath it. In fact, when the CIA, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, came to town in Kitimat, I encouraged them to copy the BC environmental assessment process because it's got a high standard. And then when you include First Nations in those environmental standards, the First Nations are doing a service to BC in terms of environmental standards because they fill the gaps. Or they even make the standards higher. So the idea that you're going to revamp one of the most stringent environmental assessments in North America, if not the world, what are you going to do? They're already so high. And when you combine that with Canadian environmental assessment standards and Canadian permitting standards, you've already got a good system. I don't see the need to revamp it. I think that causes more uncertainty and actually has a possibility to block more economic development.
Thanks, Ellis. I've known you for a while now, and I know you've always been a supporter of First Nations opportunity. And when you were elected as MLA, you stated that you will carry the message for Indigenous people and to be a full partner of the economic opportunity. Why haven't we heard that today?
Because if you want to be a full partner, then you got to engage. And the people I've worked with over the years, the Joe Bevins, the Karen Ogans, the Lacqualams, they've all engaged. So they don't need any help. What they do need is for government to foster that, not stall it, not go backwards, right? But if you're a First Nation that refuses to engage, I can't help you. And if you're a First Nation that is believing 100% the ideology that this environmental campaign has actually put into Canada from non-Canadian interests, I can't help you. So that the people that understand for First Nations that that's the opportunity for them to address their own issues and that they're having proof of it day by day, those are the people that I can help. And they've already know it. They don't need my help anyway.
So do the pro-development groups be louder to combat the anti-media? And if so, what would you suggest to do that?
You know, you can't fault the government for trying to develop policies for stricter environmental standards because government responds to the squeaky wheel. And right now, the squeakiest wheel in the province are the people marching in the streets of Vancouver or locking themselves to gates. And the pro-development side, which is the people that are working in BC right now in the resource industry and elsewhere, you're not saying anything because you're not protesting. I don't understand why. You got a job. You can't go out there and protest. But government, correct that, politicians respond to squeaky wheels because they want to gain votes. They don't want to lose votes. So they respond to the biggest noise that's out in the media today. So the people that like the idea of a job, a mortgage, buying a car, going on vacation, you're not saying anything. And that's why politicians are making the decisions they are. If you voiced it up, if you started a campaign to say, wait a minute, my future counts too, my kid's future counts too, I need a job, where's my job going to be? What are you going to do? By the way, you want to see an example of this? Go visit Fort Nelson. Go talk to them about putting up a windmill when the majority of those people are losing their houses. And they want to stay there. They got roots. So the people that have jobs, that are enjoying life, if you're ignoring this issue politically, then don't be surprised when Canadian resource development gets shut down totally.
So I've heard a lot of BC corporate companies as well as First Nations ask this question. What's your advice to both corporate BC and First Nations to be more successful and develop relationships, successful ones?
Go with examples, good and bad. I'm not claiming that industry or government are saints. Far from it. But they all have agendas. They all have objectives. Same with the First Nation. There's some really good companies doing some really good work that predates anything government's done in regards to reconciliation. Really amazing stuff. Copy it. Be creative. Because the First Nation is not really, they're not big fans of forestry or LNG or oil or mining. They're not big fans of it. What they want to achieve is to get the revenues and the jobs so there are people who are living under 60 to 70% unemployment, who are committing suicide, per capita make up the highest prison rates. In terms of social services, per capita have the most children being taken away from it. That's all these leaders want to solve. That's all they're after. So there's some really good examples out there right now, and corporations are doing so much more to help the Aboriginals in resolving their own issues than government ever has, or the Green Movement. So follow the good examples.
Thanks, Ellis. So there's a question with 8 votes here, and it's kind of a loaded question, but do other BC MLAs, federal MPs, share your opinions?
Where's John Rustad? Oh, there he is. Where's Shirley Bond? There's Shirley Bond. There's Mike Morris. You know what? Most of my opinions and my thought process were already well formed before I came into being MLA. But I've kept the Liberal caucus up to date in everything I'm thinking and everything I propose to do, and I've got nothing but 100% support from every one of them.
All right. Round of applause, please. How do you think Northern BC convince urban areas to get on our natural resources, help get our natural resources to market?
You know, that's a tough question. Because Vancouver and the Lower Mainland is living in its own different world. They got their own issues. And there's been an argument that Northwest, rural BC, actually drives the economics of BC. The resources come from our territories, the mining, the forestry, the gas, the oil, and that's basically what's making sure that Vancouver actually exists in the first place. But that argument is not resonating with Vancouver people. If there was something I'd say to urban British Columbia, we're British Columbians too. And a lot of you Vancouver people, you have family that lives in rural areas. So Vancouver residents, think about us when you're reading stories about people living in poverty, committing suicide, leaving town, because we think about you when we go to Vancouver to see Metallica or go watch a hockey game.
Awesome. I like Metallica. When every day is a fight to do the right thing and responsibility, develop our natural gas reserves, and we all see negative or biased media, do you still think this is a fight we can win?
Yeah, it is. It is. In fact, but it's going to be a fight step by step by step. It's no secret that when LNG first came to my territory and I was a brand new councillor, I opposed LNG. I opposed forestry. I was born and raised in Kitimat. I lived on the water. I was taught how to fish and hunt, and I really believe that You know, no, we shouldn't be. If anything, we should be getting rid of these industries. But it took me about a year because a fellow counselor told me that I should look at a broad spectrum of issues that are facing our people. And I should look at our welfare rates, our suicide rates, look at the poverty, look at the housing issues we have. And so it took me a year before I looked into all of it, including the Indian Act. And I came out and I decided, all things equal, I got to change my opinion. My village, who was actually being confused with all the misinformation, for 2 years believed that natural gas was actually crude oil. And we were continuously telling them, no, 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 this is actually a good, safe, clean energy. About probably 2006, we had to have a vote on a lease on one of our lands for a natural gas company to do business on our lands. And the vote came out at 92% in favor. To this day, our people who saw the benefit of natural gas affect them in their own pockets do not oppose LNG. So it's possible. And I'm seeing this happen incrementally all across BC and all these communities. So it is possible, but you can't do it at a high level using boring, bland reports and charts and graphs. You got to talk to people. Sorry for those people that put out these boring charts and graphs.
So are you engaging the federal government and stating that environmental groups do not represent First Nations?
No, but if you read the Financial Post article that was done before Christmas, and then the latest one where Martin Louis, I was hoping he'd be here today, if Martin Louis actually came out to talk about the truth of his engagement, it's picking up its own momentum. And that momentum, where these Aboriginals are understanding that they're being used by the environmental group to stop development, that momentum has got to spill over into the non-Aboriginal group. So no, I'm not going after Ottawa just yet, but I know there's First Nation groups that are going to Ottawa that are doing exactly the same thing, and I hear that the NDP are going to Ottawa to do the same thing. So I'm going to stick to whatever it is I'm doing right now, because I can't explain what I'm actually doing right now. Just getting started.
Perfect. Although we're not the highest greenhouse gas producer in total, we are one of the highest producers per capita. Do we not feel a need to significantly address this issue?
Without a doubt. And we're already doing it. This is part of the misinformation that Canada is just recklessly developing. In fact, a lot of the companies are actually doing as much as they can to reduce their emissions. I'll tell you right now, though, no offense to anybody, I don't believe the carbon tax affects that. Not if you're going to ramp it up year by year by year by year, where you're just taking revenues and you're providing programs for something else, when you're looking at the United States, who's actually clearing off red tape to get their projects approved. They're doing massive tax cuts to lure more industry to Americans. Australia's got no carbon tax. And Canada, we're doing the worst. We're doing the opposite. We're making it a hostile environment for industry to come in. And Canadians, from what I've seen when I'm talking with these corporations, the devil didn't send them. They're people too. They read the paper, they understand global issues, and they're doing as much as they can to reduce their emissions. But I'll tell you one thing, these corporations, they're not a social program, and they're not government. If they go bankrupt, they leave town. They'll take the jobs, the taxes, the investment, they'll take everything, they'll leave town. And that's when people are talking about balancing economic development with environment. If you offset that balance, these corporations will go to Louisiana. And they'll go to a place where they're welcomed with open arms. To a place like the United States, who puts environmental protection probably 6th down on their list of priorities. I don't even remember what the question was.
All right. Do you have any suggestions to assist First Nations in selecting the right company for the right project that'll help it be successful?
No, mainly because companies come to your territory and they propose projects. What I can tell you though is be careful about the speculators. Be careful about the people that come to your, because right now you don't need to have a big bankroll to get a environmental certificate. So if a person comes to your bank council who doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together but wants to start this multi-billion-dollar project, I suggest you ignore them. In this day and age, an environmental assessment can cost you anywhere from $500,000 to $3 million just to get your environmental certificate. Because it takes a lot of information, it takes a lot of consultation, it takes a lot of consultants and technical expertise. So somebody just walking off the street that used to work in the oil and gas industry back in Alberta for 3 years and comes in and says, I got an idea, I can get an environmental certificate. If he's got no money, no, I suggest you do not listen to him, because ultimately what will happen is that if they achieve that environmental certificate, they'll then go sell it to a bigger corporation for $500 million. And that's not right. If somebody comes to you and proposes a project, research them. Do they have the capital? Do they have the experience? Are they responsible? Those are the things I suggest to you. And that's what I've experienced firsthand in my territory.
So you talked about First Nations that lead example, and Haisla was very successful under your leadership to negotiate a equity position and business development with the landowner. What did you do to build the relationship?
With my neighbors? So I was pretty shocked that government knows very little about First Nations. Specifically, they know very little about the Indian Act, they know very little about treaty negotiations, and they know very little about rights and title. But our band, given the possible benefit coming to our band, we knew our neighbors had the same problems. So guys like Joe Bevan. Is Joe Bevan here? Joe, where are you? That guy didn't even show up. So they had an interest in what was happening in our territory, but the overlap issue that was actually had us fighting for years was actually going to hold back the progress of these projects. And we didn't want to add cost to the projects. So people like me and Joe Bevan got up and said, look, you're dealing with unemployment, social issues. Why don't we just solve this on a handshake and just say, you can come into my territory and get a contract, because you need jobs too. And First Nations, no matter what you think you know about First Nations don't get along. And a lot of them don't like each other. And when you're talking about in today's context, it all comes down to money for leaders to help their own people. So leaders like me and Joe Bevan just got up and said, look, we're dealing with the same problems. Let's work together. Done. Get up, handshake. And it was done. They ended up getting I think it was a contract for clearing for like $20 million. And it was us conceding. I mean, there's more than enough with these major projects to go around for everybody. There's more than enough. And nobody wants to be at the top, succeeding 100% while your neighbors down the road are still suffering. Nobody in their right mind wants to see that.
So we have time for one last question, and we'll take it from the one with the most votes. Are there any countries out there that are doing it right, have development, oil and gas, shared prosperity with others, and how can we learn about these examples?
You know what? I don't have the answer to that one. All I have is example that was in my territory that actually affected Kitimat, Terrace, all the neighboring villages, and to think that a project like this will benefit just the region is wrong. You think about one project like LNG Canada, $40 billion, that gets spread all across BC, if not Canada. So if you're looking for an example of who's doing it right, look in your own backyard. BC, you're doing it right.